Hello there, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me again. You're so good for coming back. I do appreciate it. Hope you all had a very nice Christmas and a very nice New Year. I had a wonderful Christmas and New Year. I spent most of Christmas singing God Don't Save the Queen and also shitting on a photo of Nigel Farage, as all Irish people tend to do. At least, that's what the author of this blog piece seems to assume that all Irish people do, all the time. Now, I want to make clear that I don't want you going out and harassing this person afterwards. I read through this shite, so you don't have to. You're welcome. Now, I'd imagine a lot of you saw this post just before Christmas when it started gaining traction, but for those of you who haven't, let me read out the opening sentence so you can get an idea of what we're looking at. Quote, I began writing about Ireland when Britain and Ireland fell out over Brexit. Each time I did so, I came to the conclusion that Ireland was named well. It is indeed the land of Ire. Okay, I wasn't going to start judging yet, but you could ask kind of who gave Ireland the name, because that's not the actual name of Ireland, but we'll move on. Quote, whenever I raised the least bit of criticism about Ireland, and specifically about Ireland's hostility to Britain, my timeline on Twitter is flooded with people with Irish names. The substance of these people's angers is usually Irish history, and the blame for everything in that history falls on the British. The Irish are like the worst sort of Scottish nationalists on steroids. The grievance of the average SNP voter is mild compared to the grievance of the average Irishman. The storm clouds and thunderstorms of ire that drift across the Irish Sea would make anyone suspect that the British were by far the worst people in Europe, and indeed the world. But is this just? End quote. So we have a layout here of what the arguments are going to be. The Irish, according to the author, claim that the British are the worst people in the world. It's a very broad, sweeping statement made by the Irish. Not good to do that. And this is argued by the author by using a broad sweeping statement that the Irish are the biggest complainers in the world, so we're off to a good start, folks. Finally, before we begin, I want to point a few things out, two things in particular. One is the complete lack of empathy or understanding or acceptance of the grievance of others in this piece. It's pretty obvious going through it. But the other thing that unnerves me so much are the worrying racist undertones throughout this piece. And I'm not saying the writer has racist views, but the arguments put forward by the writer are very much copied and pasted from the far-right cheat sheet. Most of the points in this essay are the exact things I heard when people were protesting against the removal of statues, or people saying that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organisation. I also want to point out that I'm not comparing the occupation of Ireland to anything that African Americans have gone through. That's not what I'm doing. I'm saying the arguments that are used are the very same. Things like, we shouldn't talk about it because it wasn't my ancestors who did it. Or, yes, things were bad, but it's just the way things were at the time. Or, things couldn't have been that bad. After all, you had X, Y, and Z when others didn't. You have heard all these arguments before used in different contexts. But when have you ever heard those arguments used in good faith? Alright, with all that in mind, let's get cracking. Part 1. Do unto others. Quote, my friends routinely refer to Britain occupying Ireland for 1,000 years, but in fact the processes that turned Ireland from being an exclusively Celtic-speaking country to being a mainly English-speaking country are nearly identical to the ones that turned Britain from being a Celtic-speaking country to an English-speaking country. Celtic-speaking ancient Britons were invaded and settled by Romans, then Angles and Saxons, and then Vikings and Normans. End quote. Okay, this is only halfway through the quote, but I do want to jump in and say that I don't really think that this is as good a point as the author thinks it is. I mean, the Vikings are really only known for raping and pillaging, and maybe, just maybe, you don't want to compare the British occupation of Ireland to that? Just a thought, you know. Quote, no one complains that the English language we speak today was the result of migration, and no one blames the migrants. This is because the average Briton is a mixture of Celtic, the Roman, the Anglo, the Saxon, and the Norman. What we are is the sum of the peoples who migrated here. To complain about these migrants is to complain that I exist, because I am the result of them. End quote. So there you have it, folks. The Irish are the real racists. Quote, if Ireland today had been invaded by no one and was still a pristine Emerald Isle that had never been contaminated by English speakers, then almost every single Irish citizen would not exist, because every Irish citizen has a Norman, an Anglo-Saxon, and a Brit in their family tree. Irish people were here already. Like, we were here before the British occupied. You do know that, right? Like, I hope that's not new information to you, because that's pretty important to know. I mean, I mightn't be here as me, but Irish people would still be here. We were there before. Doesn't matter, it's fine. Quote, "It is for this reason above all that most Irish people have English as their first language." End quote. As you can see from this very elegantly made point, this was always going to happen. It was destined to happen. And when it did happen, it was simply, destiny manifesting itself? I feel as though I've heard that term before somewhere, but I'm sure it's a good thing. Nothing bad came of it. Also, the irony of this whole immigration argument is not lost on me, considering that Brexit's already gone through, but that's besides the point. Quote, "The name of Scotland comes from the Scotai." Scotty? Scotai. I'll stick with Scotty. Quote, "The name of Scotland comes from the Scoti, who came from Ireland. I have never once met a person from Scotland who complains that the Irish Scoti conquered Scotland and wiped out the indigenous Picts. No one calls this the plantation of Scotland." End quote. Do you want to know why the Scottish don't talk about this? Because it happened so long ago. Oh, what's that? Britain invaded Ireland over 800 years ago. That is true. Well done. Gold star for you. That also happened ages ago. But do me a favour and let me know when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. That might go a long way to explain why we still talk about the British occupation. Also, no, you're right, you don't hear the Scottish calling it the plantation of Scotland, as you so hilariously put. But that's probably because it was basically just tribal warfare, and not a specifically organised systematic attempt by a monarchy to occupy foreign soil to pacify natives and confiscate land to give to those who'd been loyal to him before he took the throne. Just maybe, you know. Quote, "The union of Scotland and England was, from its outset, a partnership, if an unequal one. The political union of crowns and parliaments was accompanied by a social union of aristocratic and commercial elites and, of course, a common adhesion to Protestantism, albeit different brands. The two peoples joined forces to pursue profit and power overseas. The union of Ireland and England was another matter. It was achieved by conquest and colonialism. Indeed, Ireland can justly be called the experimental laboratory of an Anglo-Scottish project to plant British culture in strategic overseas outposts. The Irish were on the receiving end of a policy of expropriation and ethnic cleansing every bit as ruthless as that which would be attempted in North America." End quote. That is a quote from historian Niall Ferguson. But hey, who the hell is that, huh? Probably just another crybaby Irishman. Just a little baby boy crying. Well, no, actually. Oh, well, he's probably just one of those self-hating Brits. A little baby Brit. One of those who just hates everything British and who thinks Britain is the worst. Oopsie daisies. Anyway, back to the blog. Quote, "Did anything particularly unusual happen to Ireland while it was occupied by the British? Ireland was involved in wars. For example, during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, battles were fought all over the British Isles and also in Ireland. Lots of people died, and some of them in Ireland and some of them in Britain. People were also persecuted. This was a war about religion. Which form of Christianity would be dominant in Britain?" End quote. Okay, ignoring the fact that the latter half of that paragraph is written as though it was transcribed from an 8-year-old's history project, it was a war about religion. Which form of Christianity would be dominant in Britain? That's what's asked. How do you think that dominance would be asserted? And what was the major religion in Ireland at the time? Now I'm so sure this had no bearing on any of the events which occurred after this. But maybe it's something to look into. There might be a teeny tiny connection. So small you can't even see it, but there might be a small connection there. Later on you state, quote, "Irish people were treated no worse than anyone else in Europe while being ruled by the British Crown, and considerably better than many people in Europe. Russia only abolished slavery in 1861. At this time in Ireland, many Irish people had the vote, and would later use that vote to campaign for Home Rule." End quote. To equate slavery and serfdom is wildly misleading. Serfdom was indentured servitude. Awful, granted, but not slavery. And look, what's this? Well, it's my old friend, me, from a few videos ago, going to explain why indentured servitude and slavery are different things. The first distinction is humanity. Those who were indentured servants were human, which sounds incredibly basic. But those who were abducted from Africa and sold into chattel slavery were not deemed human. They were tools. They were commodities. The second difference is time. Chattel slavery was not only permanent, but multi-generational. Indentured servitude was different. It was not permanent. You worked for a period of between 4 and 10 years, depending on why you got into it, and then you were a free man. The third difference is choice.
those in indentured servitude chose to enter it, on a whole.
And yes, you're right, the Irish were trying to push through Home Rule, but if you know anything about Irish history, which clearly you don't, you would know that the Irish are very used to not being able to govern themselves, especially under British occupation. So much so, in fact, that if you ask someone what the first thing that comes to their mind when you say Home Rule, they'll most likely say Home Rule is Rome Rule. Quote, Home Rule had effectively been granted to Canada, Australia and New Zealand by the time Gladstone proposed restoring Dublin's own parliament and granting the Irish a degree of political autonomy. Yet Unionists in Westminster and the northeast of Ireland doggedly opposed the idea. Anti-Irish and anti-Catholic prejudices combined to sabotage the only viable, non-violent solution to the Irish question. End quote. Part 2. A feast or a famine? The famine. Why the fuck are we still talking about it? Who cares? I mean, in my opinion, it is one of the most important events in Irish history and forever changed the demographic of the Irish landscape, but that's not really the reason why we still talk about it. Quote, the Irish potato famine is remembered like no other famine in history, not because it was the worst, but because it can be blamed on the British. End quote. Well, it's the worst famine in Irish history, hence why Irish people still remember it and study it and talk about it. Ireland lost about 25% of its population during this period. Who cares about that though, right? You don't hear other countries complain about famines that they had, do you? You don't hear the Finnish complaining about the famine that they had. You don't hear the Scots complaining about a famine they had, when in reality they really should, because as you know, history is a uniform, smooth sphere where all items studied have to follow the exact same formula regardless of the actual historical events which occurred in that country. If one country had a famine, every single other country has to also study their own famines. That's how things work in history. That's what's important. Quote, the British of course did not want there to be a famine in Ireland. It wasn't the British who made the potatoes go bad. If there had been no potato blight, there would have been no famine and no one to blame. The British authorities, like the authorities during every other European famine in history, could have done more to save lives. They were incompetent, indifferent, and worse. End quote. Yes, they were all of those things. Also, thank you for clarifying that if something hadn't happened, it wouldn't have happened. My Paddy potato brain couldn't quite comprehend that until you ran through it, so thanks for clarifying. The Irish don't blame the British for the famine. They know that the British didn't poison the spuds, although it wouldn't surprise me. The reason the Irish lay some of the blame at the feet of the British is because some of the blame lay at the feet of the British. You've said it yourself. There was plenty of food in Ireland at the time, but this food didn't go to the Irish poor. It went to the landowners who were predominantly British, and it was shipped off the island to, you know, Britain, the place that was occupying us. Christine Keneally goes into great detail on the extraordinary amount of food which was shipped off Ireland during this period. Quote, in 1847 alone, the worst year of the famine, almost 4,000 vessels carried food from Ireland to the major ports of Britain, that is Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool and London. Over half of these ships went to Liverpool, the main port both for emigrating and for cargo. Shipping returns for all of these vessels and full details of their cargoes have survived. End quote. But that's not the point, is it? As the author of the blog correctly says, quote, soon after the Irish potato famine there were famines in Finland and Sweden. I have yet to meet a Finn or a Swede who blames anyone for these famines. I doubt most Finns and Swedes are even aware of them. End quote. So there you go. It's just those damn complaining Irish again. Although, you know, this is true. There were food shortages and famines throughout Europe at this time. But do you know what the other countries did? They lowered or completely stopped exports of food to attempt to keep as much food as possible in the hands of their citizens. Quote, in 1845 and 1846 there were calls from the corporations of Belfast, Cork, Derry, Dublin and Limerick for the ports to be closed in an effort to keep food in the country. At the same time, local and central governments throughout Europe were responding to food shortages in their own countries by closing their ports as a short-term expedient. End quote. Meanwhile, in Ireland, quote, exports of potatoes from Ireland increased, especially to England, Belgium and Holland, all of which had experienced a potato blight. End quote. This is simply scratching the surface. I don't blame you for not being informed on the famine in Ireland. but perhaps you should be even a little bit informed before you decide to claim that the Irish should simply just shut up about it. I think the main thing to take away from this entire piece is that the author simply just doesn't understand Irish people. The Irish mindset has been formed through generation after generation of British occupation and Catholic guilt. We're generally wary of anything too successful, or proud, or confident. You get the idea. If you compliment an Irish person on how they're dressed, I guarantee the first phrase out of their mouth won't be thank you. It's going to be something along the lines of, this old thing, thanks, but no, it was on sale. Things like that. The reason why there is an anti-British sentiment in Ireland isn't so much because of the occupation, or the famine, or the Troubles, although there are legitimate reasons when it comes to that one. The reason there is an anti-British sentiment in Ireland is because of British denial. The idea that the British didn't do anything wrong. The Irish would probably still be savages if the British hadn't arrived to civilise us, right? The Irish should just suck it up, get on with it, shut up, and get over it. And I understand you're sick of hearing these arguments because that's essentially all we heard throughout this entire Brexit debacle. If you're looking for a concrete reason why there's anti-British sentiment in Ireland, all you have to do is read this blog post. With its arrogance and its denialism and its ahistorical garbage, the reasons are laid out perfectly.